can go ahead and get started. Again, the COVID speaker series is ultimately focused on trying to understand the politics and policies surrounding COVID-19. And we've made this transition now. At the first couple series we had were really focused on political dimensions, trying to understand intergovernmental relationships, what role of government is responsible for implementing and regulating around COVID-19 and regulating social distance measures. And we've made this transition now to thinking about the policy implications. I think we're all very excited to have Vice President Greg Simmons. He's the Vice President for Institutional Advancement. Talk about the implications that COVID-19 has on higher education. And we're all very excited for your talk. And without further ado, let's welcome Vice President Greg Simmons.
Thank you so much. It's great to see everybody. Thanks for having me. What I kind of thought I'd do is talk broadly, maybe for 15 or 20 minutes or so, just to give you a sense of some of the things that we're seeing in hiring and recruitment. What's the product supposed to do for people as they come out of the place? What are we seeing in entrepreneurship and commercialization? What's the environment for people starting companies? Talk a little bit about athletics and kind of broadly what we're seeing on the campus and kind of these big buckets. Talk a little bit about some of the national data, some of the data in UMBC, and kind of some of my own kind of little reflections on each of those things. And then hopefully leave plenty of time for a conversation to answer questions or for you to push back on some of my observations. I would say I'll start by saying what I'm not. I'm not an entrepreneur. I'm not a serial entrepreneur, practicing entrepreneur. I am not a faculty person. I'm not a researcher, although I do research and I use research a lot in the work that I do. I'm primarily kind of, I'm a frontline administrator. And so if you look at kind of my areas of responsibility, I've been at UMBC a long time. I'm in my 28th year at UMBC, believe it or not. I know I look 28, but I'm in my 28th year here. And I started in the Shriver Center, working with adjudicated youth in the choice program. I ran the internship programs for a number of years. I did corporate development, and then was Dr. Rabowski's chief of staff for a couple of years. And currently, my portfolio is really an amalgamation of all the things that I've done over those years. So I'm responsible for the fundraising and marketing for the campus. The literature calls it the chief advancement officer. The marketing and communications is a part of my division, a part of the work that we do, everything from our external facing messaging to supporting our work and enrollment. The research park, so we have 135 startup companies on campus. And so that economic development and that partnership with the regional economic community is in my bucket. And then I also have some responsibility with athletics, mostly to try and figure out how we kind of take what we're doing really, really well with student athletes and have that grow the community as people come and experience UMBC. How does that become just another part of the resources that we have as a place? So that just kind of gives you a sense of who I am. And again, I'm happy to have, if anybody wants to just interrupt in the middle and say, tell me what that means. I'm going to read a couple. I'm not going to read anything, but I will look at my notes from time to time. And after that, hopefully we can have a conversation. Is that okay? Sound good? Okay. I'll start a little bit with kind of what we're seeing in employment. So I certainly am I'm a big believer that that education, both at undergraduate and graduate degree level, is absolutely about kind of discovering knowledge, figuring out who you are and how you learn. This ethic of discovery, but I think it can also be about how you put yourself on a pathway for meaningful employment. I think we have to be able to carry both of those ideas in our head at the same time and value both of those things. And we are known as a place that really does a good job at helping people graduate and go to employment or graduate school. Currently, in this kind of COVID climate, there's been a lot of speculation. So, we've been looking at some data. The National Association of Colleges and Employers did a survey. They've been kind of surveying employers and universities pretty regularly over the past several months. Recent survey, about 250 employers said about 8%, about almost 10% of those employers pulled back on summer internships this summer. So people had internships that those employers decided to pull back. The good news is that most of them actually didn't. A lot of folks kept their interns. They may have had them pivot to have to work remotely, but most of them hosted. They may have delayed the start. Most of the folks who offered jobs to new college graduates at the end of the spring semester, again, most of them are actually honoring those job offers. They've seen the start date be a little bit flexible, and certainly, people have had to really focus on, how do they work from their home instead of going into an office, which has implications, I think, for how long people will stay, how they fit into an organization, how they actually be able to, how are you learning on the job if you're working by yourself, or in this context, more and more. So those, I think, are things that we'll be looking at. We did see, if career centers and universities are kind of launch pads, we do know that a lot of universities have had to face shrinking budgets, and they're trying to figure out how do they support the work that they do. Through July, about 15% of the colleges and universities surveyed, about 475 in the sample, about 15 had seen both staff and budget reductions of 10 to 15%. And so, that does have implications. And we know that our Career Center does a great job, but they're really lean. So, so how we're able to meet the needs of students and employers at the same time in those centers is going to be really, I think, a thing to watch over the next couple of years. You look at that interface between universities and employers. Career centers and universities are also increasingly focused on how do they support their alumni as they either return to work, as they try and upskill and get to the next level job. And university employers are depending on them to do the same kind of thing. So the number of folks that we have to serve is going up in an environment where the number of jobs may be flat or going down, and the resources supporting those organizations is going to be constrained for a while. What we're seeing at UMBC, we have a great career center. So Christine Routson, the director of the center, gave me some data recently. Some of you may have participated in the online career fair. Last year was our biggest career fair ever. We had 162 employers, up from about 130. We had been, from 2014 to last year, we had the year before last year, we had about 120, 130 employers visit for career fair. Last year we had 160. This year, it was all virtual. We had 82 organizations, right? So that's a pretty significant drop off in the number of employers who participated. A lot of reasons. They didn't necessarily want to participate in a virtual activity. Maybe some have seen, constrictions in the jobs they're going to be offering. What we think is they just don't know yet. They're just not sure where they're going to be. They're not sure what kind of jobs they're going to have. And they're being really, really cautious and really, really careful in what expectations they set. What good employers have understood is they represent a brand on campuses where they recruit heavily. And what they don't want to do is come in and promise jobs and then not deliver, because they know that message spreads from faculty to students, and then their brand reputation on campus suffers. So they've been pretty cautious, but they're staying engaged. They're still doing resume reviews, those kinds of things. So we're encouraged by that. Some of the things that I would say to be keeping an eye on. While it's too early to say what's going to go on, you can look in the past, 2 recessions and get some interesting information there. We have a huge federal sector that still does have a lot of jobs and has a lot of needs. And so that has been able to kind of balance us out a little bit relative to other parts of the country over the last couple of recessions. It'll be interesting to see if that holds. We also have some pretty major investments from big companies in this region, HQ2, everybody talks about Amazon and what that means. But Amazon clearly is not slowing down right now in this current economy for a lot of different reasons. And they have a pretty huge tail. And so that has implications for Baltimore to Richmond that I'd pay attention to. And not just for people with tech degrees. They're hiring people from a lot of different disciplines, a lot of different domains, and they're offering a lot of different kind of job trainings and job skills. Look at alternative credentials, watch those trends. People are talking about them everywhere. My perspective is they're only as good as the employer honoring them. If an employer says, do this credential, but then they won't hire you with the credential. Don't do the credential, right? That's kind of really, that's something that we're going to have to learn a lot, but you see a lot more people talking about those kinds of things. And I think it's going to be really, really interesting to watch. And the bottom line, I think, is skills, tangible skills matter to a lot of employers. But a liberal arts degree, the ability to think critically, to ask good questions, and write a really good sentence or a really good paragraph is a tangible skill. And you have to be able to articulate that when you're going into a really hyper-competitive job market. So that's kind of, I think, a sense of what we're seeing in employment from the university side. I think if entrepreneurship is the next step of that, people are, everywhere you look, people are talking about, you shouldn't have to work for somebody else. What's the gig economy? How do you start your own company? What does this look like? What's a venture community? What's an innovation economy? If you look nationally, there's been a huge explosion in how undergraduate institutions and graduate institutions think about entrepreneurship. And UMBC has been really a big part of that conversation. The Kauffman Foundation in Kansas City, which is kind of one of the big places that does research in this domain. In 1985, they published a study in 2006 that saw from 85 to 2006 an increase from about 500 classes teaching entrepreneurship to over 5,000, just in that 20-year period. Today, depending on what you look at, you'll see anywhere from 800 to 1,000 entrepreneurship centers at universities across the country. UMBC is the distinction of having one of the first entrepreneurship centers at a university that doesn't have a business school. Launched in part by the Kauffman Center, we got a $2.5 million grant from Kauffman. We raised another couple $1 million. So the Alex Brown Center for Entrepreneurship is a big part of that. And so entrepreneurship is a part of an expectation. For us, what we talk a lot about at UMBC, and I think what you're seeing all across the country, is there's always been two kinds of entrepreneurship, right? There's been the kind of entrepreneurship that makes Fast Company in Fortune magazine, right? The Hewlett Packard story, or the Mark Zuckerberg story, this kind of big tech. You go to Silicon Valley, you get venture startup when you explode. And then there's the story of the immigrant business, right? Somebody moving from someplace else, opening a business or opening a community-based company, and building that over time. What we've realized is there's just a myriad of different kinds of entrepreneurship that exists in those spaces. So entrepreneurship accelerators, incubators. Right now, the UMBC Research Park has 130 companies, 2 distinct incubators, one in life sciences and one in cybersecurity, with the idea being, how do you help subsidize the rent for a startup company so they can grow over time and get access to resources to get to the place where ideally maybe they can get some venture capital or they can self-fund. And again, if you're a software company, you see a lot more companies self-funding, not needing that venture capital. Life science companies or kind of tech companies needing a different kind of investment to scale over time. But entrepreneurship at UMBC in 2010, when the economy last crashed in 2010, this region saw a huge explosion of startup companies. A lot of tech folks and science folks got laid off, and they just went right to work immediately starting their own companies. Real estate was cheap. They had expertise in networks. They leveraged that, and there was a number of nascent incubators that got them off the ground. And that's led us to a place in Maryland where we're really seeing more investment from venture capital companies, more deals with universities around intellectual property. And so we're watching this kind of dialogue about innovation economy, venture capital. It looks like right now the market still seems to be pretty safe, but for slightly different reasons. What we're seeing right now is the CARES Act. Some of the aid money really helped keep startups open. It also kept people in jobs where they might have been laid off and started companies. So, it's not a bad story, but it's, again, a little bit early to tell, what's coming out of things. We're also seeing venture capital looking at smaller deals, being more comfortable making seed-based investments in smaller companies kind of before they really have a lot of revenue or a lot of traction. And there's a lot of dialogue about those companies really wanting to find investment in women, Black, Latinx entrepreneurs to really start to level the playing field in what's happened in the investment community. It's going to be really interesting to see what happens. What we know at UMBC is we've done a really good job incubating companies. And we have the largest cluster of cybersecurity startups we can find at a university anywhere in the country, about 40. About 25% of those have been started by African-American or Latinx entrepreneurs, and about 25 have been started by women. At the same time, we look at our range of programming, and we have not necessarily had some of the kinds of services that we would expect those entrepreneurs might need to be successful. We've only, so we've pivoted a little bit. We've brought in some entrepreneurs in residence who look like the underserved communities, underrepresented communities that are in those research parks. So we now have some women entrepreneurs in residence, some Black entrepreneurs in residence who can talk about the experience that they've had and help people understand how to build their companies in the context. It's not clear that the venture community, they're talking a lot about needing to invest in a new kind of more balanced racial and gender economy. But it's unclear if that's really following. Some numbers on TechCrunch, I was looking at the numbers for the first half of the year, and TechCrunch saw a little bit of a drop off from year to year. The first half of this year was only down about 5 to 7% in total venture deals in startup companies across the country. So not quite as bad as I would have expected given where we were in March and April. It is pretty significant, though, that the number of investment in women-owned companies is both down in dollars and in the number of deals over last year. And maybe even more disheartening is the number of investments that TechCrunch did a look. They looked at about all of the companies that got investments in the third quarter of this year, from $500,000 to $2 million. There's about 1,300 deals, funded deals, and only 2.2% went to Black entrepreneurs. And so, that's down a little bit from the previous year. It could be a lot of things, but it'll be really important, I think, to kind of watch those trends and see if they hold, if we really want to have an innovation economy that's robust, that's meeting the needs of a lot of different communities and is bringing in the ideas of people from all different backgrounds. Let me talk about athletics for 2 minutes, and then I'll talk a little bit about what I think is happening on campus, and then open it up to conversation, if that makes sense. So I'd say in some ways I'm the least prepared to talk about athletics. It's that I'm a sports fan, but I'm not a sports expert, and I've really only recently been providing real direct leadership and support to athletics. But it's a really strange time in athletics, because in one hand it's such an important thing for the psyche of communities in a lot of different ways. They talk about those happiness index and whether or not it actually brings real investment to communities. Winning teams help communities feel better one way or the other. And college teams, college sports, college athletics does bring an element of pride and energy to certain communities in some ways. I think I would say most of the data will show it doesn't necessarily return money the way that most of the media or most people actually think. There are actually very few athletic programs across the country that actually make money. They generate revenue, but they're not necessarily net positive. And so I think it's really interesting. We're watching right now. The pro sports are helping to give guidance to the NCAA as the NCAA tries to run programs on college campuses. And I think what you're seeing right now with college football is really shows how strange it's going to be. The Power 5 conferences, some deciding they're going to play and some deciding they're not. And then those two that said they weren't going to play deciding that they were going to play halfway through the season. You look at some schools canceling games because they have incidents of COVID on their teams or postponing games. And Notre Dame, they canceled a trip out to the East Coast. And then you see other schools that are playing. So Virginia Tech, I think for the second week in a row, their roster was down by more than 15 players who had apparently contracted COVID, but the team still played. So, how teams and how universities are making decisions, I think, is really, in athletics, in many cases, a reflection of how they're making decisions and what they do broadly. It's going to be a real interesting watching March Madness, right? I referenced my ticket. They have 16/1 ticket. March Madness is actually the event that makes money for the NCAA, the organization, and actually does provide revenue to almost all of the Division I programs across the country in one way, shape, or form. And last year, the cancellation of March Madness was devastating to academic budgets across the country. So you look at things like Stanford. Stanford loses ticket revenue, they lose sponsorship, and then they lose revenue from the NCAA for all of the championships that they win, right? So I think Stanford cut something like 11 athletic programs in the last couple of months. A lot of programs, Division I programs, are laying off or furloughing their staff. You even see it in Under Armour. Look at Under Armour is trying to remove itself from major apparel contracts with big universities across the country because the cancellation of games has hurt their bottom line. And so the revenue model this is really going to test the revenue model for a lot of different places. UMBC is in a good place in that we don't really have a ton of ticket revenue and we don't have a lot of sponsorship deals. And so we're not really seeing a lot of negative impact on the programs from there, but student fees do play a big role in those things. And we're not charging the athletic fee if students can't participate, if they're not living on campus, even if they are, we've suspended that right now. So UMBC is taking a pretty conservative approach. We are preparing. Our conference wants to have a basketball season for men's and women's basketball. Our teams are preparing for competition, and we're working on a schedule for men's and women's basketball. And what we're really gonna try and do is see, can we actually run a program in a way that's consistent with our goals of health and safety for the community? And if we can, we're gonna try and do that. And if we can't, then we won't. But we're going on the belief right now that it's going to be possible, and so that's going to look like limiting overnight trips, maybe no overnight trips, so up and back. Maybe looking at playing some teams only one time, right? So instead of going all the way to New Hampshire or Vermont and then coming all the way back, maybe only playing one of them once, or breaking the America East into two divisions, a South and a North. Not playing any out of conference games maybe that require more than an hour bus trip. So, which I'm kind of excited about as a fan. I love the idea of a hyper local schedule, like the possibility of that. And again, the schedule's not set yet. So these are just the way we're starting to think about it. So, but imagine just the opportunity to really increasingly play local teams a lot more often, and how that could really generate possible excitement in the fan bases in the region, and maybe elevate kind of the mood, give people a distraction from all the challenges that we're facing. So I think it'll be interesting to see what happens with athletics. I'm happy to answer questions if I can there. In terms of what's happening at UMBC, so I'm part of the what we call the FPCC. It was I was first on the emergency task force that made decisions in March through June. In July, we shifted from that kind of crisis management system more to a fall planning committee with 5 different work groups, one on academics, one on the student experience, one on research, one on events and activities, and one on, I'm going to lose the last one, administration writ large. And so that's the group that kind of planned for the fall. It's still called FPCC, but now we're planning for the spring. And so, thinking about how do you maintain safety and security and health of the community? How do you put people in a position where they can be successful? How do you keep the essential business of the university going, which at its core is teaching and learning, and research, solving meaningful problems in a time that's kind of unprecedented, at least in my lifetime. And so I think we're doing a pretty good job. We know it's not easy on anybody. And so whether faculty have had to learn how to work new technology skills, or students having to figure out, how to maybe work in a house with younger siblings, or when they have to be at home and have responsibility for caregiving for aging parents. Everybody's trying to manage through these challenges, and we're trying to learn from the experiences of our students and faculty and have that reinform what we do. So, we're setting policy, we're setting procedures, but it's really informed almost in real time by the things that we're learning and the feedback that we're getting just about every day of every week since March 13th. If I step back and think what all of this means for higher education, if you had asked me in May, I would say that higher education is going to dramatically look different a year from then, from last May. I've kind of backed off that. I think what we're going to see is the things that are easy. There were changes coming into our industry, into the work that we do. The easy changes, this is going to accelerate those easy changes, right? We're going to come up with more enlightened work from home models. We're going to improve our ability to meet the teaching and learning needs of different people. We know more students want to take classes on the weekends in their own time because they're working. We know people want to do more self-directed work. So it's going to help us figure those things out. We're going to do a better job of integrating technology into those kinds of things. The things that are the real big challenges in our sector, this is not necessarily going to solve those problems. So the cost of education, it's going to raise a lot more questions, but it's not going to provide any really easy answers. Tenure, the role of tenure, which is an often talked about, thing that needs to change if we want to kind of continue to see higher education. And I'm not giving an opinion on this, colleagues, but that's one of those questions when the people look at higher education, say, is this something that's good for higher education or bad? COVID's not going to change that conversation. It's not going to really have us have that conversation in a real meaningful way. Athletics is going to look different, but it's not going away. And COVID's not going to make it going away. I think in some cases it's just going to separate, the Power Five from everybody else in a way that fundamentally was going to happen, but it's not going to change it. I think I was talking to one of our graduates who's the dean of the dental school downtown. His name is Mark Reynolds. He's got 2 degrees from here. He's a brilliant guy. I said, what's going to happen? What do you think the change is? What do we have to do? And he said, we have to really be thinking about the cost of education. We have to do a better job at thinking about the cost savings. We talked a little bit about this idea of free college, and these are my words, not Mark's. I think as we go into this political cycle, and everything's a political cycle, but this idea of free college is a little disingenuous because there's no such thing as free college or free education. It's expensive. The challenge is we don't do a good job of telling people and showing as an industry what those costs are. They're not transparent or they're not easy to track. Everybody does it a little bit differently and none of us do it well. And we haven't been able to show why the increase in cost is important. We have to figure out ways to deal with student debt in a fundamentally different way. And I don't think our government, at the state or federal level right now, has the resources to actually fully subsidize the cost of education for large numbers of people. So as you're watching and listening to your electeds right now, it may be true that people deserve the opportunity to get degrees. The question is, where does that get paid for from? Because it's not free. So ask that question as you're hearing the argument. Call it subsidized, call it discounted, call it scholarships from somewhere, but free. It may be free to the person getting the degree, but someone has to pay for it. And we need to do a better job of helping people understand both what the real cost is and where the value is. Let me kind of generally stop there and see if there's any questions, if there's anything I left out, or see if you would argue with some of the things that I've been suggesting that might happen over the next couple months.
Great. Well, let me start by thanking you. This was certainly an interesting conversation, and it intersects really well with a lot of the research that I do focused on economic development, growth, how we think about economic growth. And I'll lead off the question, but then I'm sure there's going to be a lot of others who are going to be interested in this particular topic. There's some consideration of what kind of recovery we're going to see. Is it going to be this V-shaped recovery? And I've been hearing recently something that may be more like a K-shaped recovery, where some of the individuals kind of on the higher end, maybe knowledge-based jobs are going to recover differently than those on the lower end, right? And from the standpoint of students going through the program now, what would you say are kind of the key takeaways in terms of maybe what they should be doing right now for themselves to, get through this process and recover well and get employment? But then also, if you could reflect on what this might mean for those on the lower end and how, as a political science, a policy focus. We help those that need kind of extra assistance in this recovery. And then I'll open it up after that.
Yeah, so I think that's the K-shaped recovery. I think there's real risk of that, right? The people with skills, the people with some resources, the people who already have access to employment opportunities, the need for people with a specific set of skills that often, at least at the entry level, look like real formal technical skills. The demand is going to be such that the market is going to be really good for those folks right now. And so you can see that going on a path. A lot of the, if you look at the cash that big companies have that they're not spending right now, they're either going to start to spend to actually reinvest in training for people who have aptitude but not the preparation to help their own workforce, or they're going to keep the cash, and that's going to drive the discrepancy further and further. I think in some of the places, in the middle and late part of the summer, I got in a lot of arguments. I spend a lot of my time defending college students. And when people were talking about college students who were out, going to parties and going to bars and doing dumb things, the point that I regularly made is college students are working at bars. They're working at restaurants. For them to pay for their education, they're having to put themselves in positions where they're in high-risk environments to be able to invest in themselves. And so, the real challenge right now is a lot of those jobs are going away. And the question will be, can a federal recovery help keep some of those jobs open that can provide some sort of subsistence level existence for people while they're investing in themselves, provide some economic vitalities in communities, and what will happen there. I tend to think that it will. I think they have to find a way to subsidize the kind of businesses that are going to put people back to work. And the good news is, it seems like it may go that way. I think when people are looking at recovery, just don't look at the stock market as an indication of recovery. Everybody uses that as a lever, and it's really only one indicator. So you got to look at unemployment. You got to look at those kinds of things, and that's what I would encourage you to do. I was an English major. And so I did my master's of public policy at UMBC because I felt like what I didn't have was some of those quantitative skills that were going to increasingly be important. What I would say is not going to sound like very enlightened advice. I would encourage every student to do internships as quickly as they can, or to work with faculty who are thinking about and are looking for working with students and getting involved in research. Anything that you can be doing to understand how the skills that you're getting in your major can be applied. I love this idea of kind of public humanities, because I do think, as somebody who, Dr. Abowski, if you've ever heard him, he says, if you can write well, you can think well. Those two things that go really well together. What we can't do if we have, some of those skills that don't look like technical skills is be defensive. We have to help people. We have to articulate to people why my ability to write, to do creative problem solving, to apply some of the things I've learned in the major that I chose because I didn't know what else I wanted to do, and I really loved language. I have to help figure out ways to translate that to employers so they understand the value that I can provide. And then the last thing I would say is, if you have a job, don't quit a job. Don't quit a job until you have a job, right? We oftentimes will see people that, and listen, if it's unsafe, if you're in an environment that, that you can't take care of yourself, or you really feel like your ethics are being challenged, quit that job. But oftentimes people will say, I'm going to quit a job because I hate it, and I'm going to just put all my energy into getting a new job. Employers want to see you have a track record of employment. And it's such a demoralizing feeling not having that work. So don't quit a job until you have a job. Do internships, work with your faculty, write all you can, and network. Go to the Career Center. We have a Career Center that does an excellent job. And so I don't know. That's a bunch of answers to a really hard question. I don't know if any of them were good, but that's what I'd say.
No, thank you. I think that's very helpful. Hopefully it gives some takeaways. And I certainly love the idea of internships and, trying to kind of work directly with organizations and apply those skills because I think that's fundamental. So, all right, well, let me open it up. I'm sure there's a lot of burning questions from students and others here. So.
Yeah, I've got a lot. There's a lot here to dig into, but I guess I'll start with kind of the broader question about UMBC specifically, in that I think insofar as UMBC is a higher percentage of commuters and older students and people who are and people who work and is I guess is very easy to contrast with, like, Harvard University and the Quad and the red brick buildings and everybody like being in a residential college type situation. It does seem to me that the kind of cost benefit analysis is easier to make at this moment in time because, frankly, the tuition is a lot more affordable than it would be at an expensive private institution. And UMBC already had a lot of the tools in place for digital education and people doing the mini masters, et cetera, et cetera. What is lost, though, or how would you phrase the difficulties of translating the kind of day-to-day interactions that we get to have on campus, even if you don't live there, even if you're like me, I commute, into the digital environment? Because at this moment, like, just providing my own example, I take a full load and I interact with my professors, when I can. But obviously they're under a lot of pressure, so you don't want to badger people with questions. And even one of my professors who I had a larger out of classroom relationship with, it's harder to ask for her time now. Whereas before, I could see her walking around campus, say, "Hey, how you doing? This is going well, et cetera, et cetera." So I'm curious, how do we foster the community, I guess, when you cannot be present with one another?
I don't know. How would you do it? I'm not being flip. So, I don't know Eric that well. Carolyn knows me pretty well. Jim, I've taken classes with Jim. I work with his daughter-in-law. I'm kind of, I get a tremendous amount of work done between my meetings, walking from the administration building to the Commons with a guest, or walking to meet Jack Seuss in the engineering and IT building, or walking across campus with a prospective donor. I think what they've increasingly become called is like these hallway conversations, right? As a manager and as a leader, what I struggle with, and what I've struggled with a lot, is the ability to say, when you're on campus, when you're in that community, and you hear things, going sideways, you can literally stand in the hallway and call 3 different people together and say, "What do you hear? How do you understand this? Let's solve it and figure it out." And now everything has to happen kind of in this context. I think so how do you break it down? I think the first thing is we have to make sure that we take a second and really be cognizant of what we're struggling with ourselves. I talked to an alum on Friday who's a big leader at Merck, and he said, the first 3 months of this pandemic, everybody was excited because they had to work at home. And so instead of commuting in Philadelphia traffic, they're like, I have 2 extra hours of my day that I can do work. And now what they're realizing is those 2 hours, that hour in and that hour home, were an hour when they might call their mom or their former college roommate, or just decompress, and they don't have those kinds of things. So is it Quinn or Quinlan?
Either is fine. Either is fine.
So
I think met me on campus as Quinn.
I know, so. You do look familiar. So I empathize with your question. I think for me, for what we're trying to do is how do you, first of all, provide our colleagues and our students as much flexibility as we can, because we don't really know what situations they're in when they're living at home, or how they're managing their lives outside of this context. So a lot more flexibility. When students moved onto campus, the number of students who moved onto campus in September, if they came onto campus and it wasn't working out, they could back out of their contract and get a reimbursement, right? So putting policies in place, or at least practices in place right now that give people as much flexibility as they can to manage the situation. Try to find ways through things like the Stay Black and Gold Fund to provide a little bit of relief for people who have real urgent financial need. And then I think we're trying to find ways that so we have an events and activities group right now that's trying to figure out, to your example, if the Honors College, the swimming and diving team, and the cyber scholars all had a mix of students who were both residential and commuter, those communities would smash together dozens of times a day on a regular day. So they're trying to find ways now to help those communities get together. So is it the Honors College doing a trivia contest and challenging the swimming and diving team to points? How do you find ways that even in this remote environment, give people a chance to interact? I think it's also increasingly finding the ways that we can, as students are complying and faculty are complying with the rules, what can we additionally open up? So we're trying to find, is there a way that in the spring we can think like having intellectual sports, Baja group or Model UN, or is there a context where you can allow more students to come back together and have that live experience? And I think the last thing we've got to do is if we find something that works, we got to share it with people, because it's really, really hard right now for people to see what's working, because what feels like it's working for one person may not work for another. So I wish I had a better answer for you, but it is something that we're struggling with and we talk a lot about every day.
I mean, it's undeniably working in the sense that there is no COVID-19 outbreak at UMBC.
Yep. So a question that I ask, right, and to your point is, so if you look at what's happening, so you can juxtapose our approach with a lot of the SEC schools, right? Not just in terms of athletics, but just broadly. I have a friend who's got triplets, and one's at Georgia, one's at Virginia Tech, and one's at College Park. So the three of the big Power 5 conferences. Georgia hasn't closed down. And so I look at the schools around us, Towson and College Park, which have tried to be pretty conservative, tried to be safe. And then you look at some of these bigger places in different parts of the country, and I'm not judging, I'm saying what they've done is they've let a lot more people come back, and they've had a lot more students get COVID. And so they've kind of normalized that living with COVID is part of the university experience. What are the implications for us next fall if we still keep a reduced capacity on campus to keep people safe, but high school seniors are looking across the country and see how other places have normalized living with COVID? And so I think those are some of the kinds of things that we're trying to figure out right now, both as we support our current community, as well as we think about the community that we need to keep doing the work that we do as a university.
I'd love to pick up on that point, because one of the other questions I had, one, I guess I would wonder how much inter-institutional learning is going on and how best to prepare for this. But, I see colleagues that are at other institutions that don't seem to be, placing maybe public health as squarely as a focus. And I'm wondering what you think in terms of a lot of these other institutions, how they're weighing out, say, public health and economics and finances and, kind of other dimensions beyond sort of the public health, and what role like politics may play in all of this.
Yeah. So I'm a fundraiser, and so I'm an optimist, and I do believe that I have to go kind of the sense that for the most part, I know this industry well enough, I know enough people in it. I do believe that health and wellness is a priority of higher education writ large. I really do, and that so that if you take that as a given, that just means there's a long continuum of how people are exercising, what they see as protecting health and wellness of that community. I think what I would say is, in the state, there's a lot of information sharing. The chancellor, Dr. Perman took over as chancellor just last year, and I give him a ton of credit to have a medical doctor be the head of the system. We were able to make some decisions really quickly. We were able to really draw on really, really good knowledge and information really early that helped us. But it's also putting us in a position where we're very conservative, right? We really think that we have to minimize the number of cases. And if we do that, that's in the best interest of the community. There are other places that have just kind of taken a different approach, right? They just said, well, it's going to be out there. There's not a lot of people in the ages of 18 to 22. They're getting, but they're not getting really, really sick. And we could protect our faculty in a lot of different ways. And we're a major land grant institution in a rural area. And if we're not here, then the economy of these communities is devastated, right? So they've looked at it through a different set of filters. I think the answer is going to be that everybody's right partially around a lot of different things. And hopefully the number of deaths of 18 to 25-year-olds doesn't go up. And hopefully we're able to keep faculty safe, because the faculty are in there's a lot more faculty that are in high risk categories than students. There's high risk people all across, but there's a lot more faculty who have high risk. I think you'll see the information sharing get better. Speaking, just from our experience, we've been so heads down. It's hard to describe, how many little decisions we've had to make from 2 weeks before March 13th to today, and how every decision creates 10 more decisions. But if you don't make a decision, then there's an infinitesimal number of decisions you have to make. So we've been really, really heads down. I'm actually I'm on a CASE is the big national organization in my field, Council for the Advancement and Support of Education. And I'm on a commission. And so we have a big one-day meeting next week about what's going on and what we're seeing. So I think you'll see a lot more information sharing in the next quarter as people get through this semester, start preparing for the spring. And you'll see a lot of it come out through places like APLU, ACE, some of the organizations that help kind of host the dialogue. There's a lot of noise. There's a lot of consultancies, a lot of, for-profit orgs they're going to send out information. This is what works. Here's the silver bullet. Here's what's happening today. It's not even trend analysis. It's not even data mining. They're just kind of picking some. It's kind of like the BuzzFeed of our industry. And so you really got to dive into those things to see if there's any real nugget of substance in them before you believe too many of them too deeply.
Great, thank you. And we often talk about it in the context of state and local government, states and localities kind of being laboratories of democracy, and getting to at least see experimentally how these things play out across universities has some capacity for us to learn from it. So thank you. Great. What other questions do we have?
I did that good. I did so good. There's no other questions.
This is, this topic certainly has a broader impact on everyone here. So,
I am obviously the sports issue seems, like all of this unresolved. But even before COVID, there was, and particularly in the state of Maryland and in the legislature of Maryland, there was a lot of questions asked, questions raised about the value of how student athletes currently participate in both of those dual activities, being students and being athletes. And it is pretty grim to me. I mean, you ask student athletes, I'm not saying you personally, but we ask student athletes to put their bodies on the line as part of their payment for getting an education. And I don't want to be I understand that this is a much more complicated issue than I'm necessarily portraying it, but it definitely seems like if it's an option to return to campus and to be a student, that's one thing, but to be asked to be returned to campus and to participate in athletics, which necessitates being around a lot of people in large groups, you're definitely asking people for a lot. And if if their education is tied to their performing their athletics in the form of scholarship, then it's a pretty clear economic calculation that you make. You know, either you find the money to go to school, or you're kind of like shanghaied into playing sports in an even more stressful period of time than normally. I'm wrapping up. Is this an opportunity to kind of re-examine the relationship between between athletics and education? Because I think that conversation's been begging to be asked, to be had for 20 or 30 years, even longer maybe. And should we continue with this idea that the university having captured elite amateur athletics really being the best for both of those groups of people, you know, both for the amateur elite athletes and for students?
So I'm going to give you a very unsatisfactory answer, I'm afraid. I think I don't know the answer. I think you see a couple different things, a couple observations. You know, it's the industry is starting to change a little bit. The name, image, and likeness stuff, I think, is another step towards giving athletes a lot more freedom and a lot more opportunity to do things that other non-athlete students can do without giving it a second thought, right? And I think that the place that I really get, and I'm not an expert in this domain, but the thing that I see happening broadly in this conversation is people look at the athletes in the revenue sports at the big Power 5 conferences where students do have a legitimate chance to maybe actually go from here to to a transformational earning opportunity in professional sports versus everybody else, right? Almost all of the other college athletes across the country is they're constrained by those same set of rules, but they're competing in a sport that they love, knowing that this is the end of the road at a place that they picked that they thought's going to put them in a position to be successful as a professional for the rest of their lives. And so those two, I think the name, image, and like this stuff starts to address some of those things. It's going to play out over a longer period of time. I think the way we've tried to approach it, and I think the NCAA has done a pretty good job so far, at least this year, by saying if you don't feel safe, you don't have to come back right now, and you're not going to give up your scholarship. We're not going to take your scholarship away at UMBC. So if you feel like this isn't an environment you can feel comfortable in right now, then we want people to feel safe and make informed decisions. And to my knowledge, that's the way we're approaching it, and we want to right now. It's a short-term solution to what could be a long-term problem. But I also think, Stanford, I referenced the Stanford example. They got a lot of heat because Stanford has produced a ton of Olympic athletes in lesser known sports, and they cut all those sports, right? So like, a couple different kinds of volleyball, fencing, a couple other things. And when I saw the outcries, oh no, our Olympic hopefuls are in big trouble, that felt weird too, right? Is Stanford really supposed to be the Olympics factory for the nation? That's not, to me, I think, what they're supposed to be going for. So it's a really hard, complex question. I wish I had a better answer for you.
Great, thanks, Quinlan. And I noticed too earlier in the discussion, Meher mentioned that she's seen a lot of student events plan online activities. So, that hopefully is another way in which students can kind of engage to your earlier question, Quinn. So I'm seeing a question come in regarding college sports. Is there any talks about having a bubble, or is the colleges going to decide if fans can attend the game?
Yeah. So, I think if you ask Brian Barrio, the athletic director, he'll say the bubble is like, the NBA can do a bubble because they've got, hundreds of millions of dollars to close off Disney World and bring in barbers and restaurants and a golf course, right? you know what it's like to be a college student. You know, it's a bubble is just not a realistic expectation for how we are asking students to live and work and play and perform as athletes. So the question then becomes, in what can you do to limit exposure and risk for those student athletes? So, you know, how frequently do you test? You know, how do you make sure you control the number of students who are in the building and how often and who's in the building at the same time, and how clean are you keeping it? And then for us, it's, you know, if you're playing an out of conference game, how do you make sure that our rules are the same as your rules, and that you're doing the same things that we're doing? And how do you use the science to guide the decisions? You know, based on that, right now, it doesn't look like fans will be in the building. And that's the same for, quite frankly, concerts. We've got students who are doing senior performances in the Performing Arts and Humanities building. And, you know, I'd love for them to be able to have, you know, people come hear their performances. But right now we're not going to be able to do that because it's just too hard to manage the risk equitably. So I think the bubble isn't a reality right now, but the idea of really optimizing safe as much as you can and then stopping if you think there's something wrong. And then part of optimizing the safety is going to really be minimizing fans for at least in the short term until there's a way that you can, whether it's a vaccine or another way to really kind of safely keep the athletes from the fans and the fans from the fans. I mean, I watch college football. I'm a fan. I watch college football all weekend, and you see, you know, from Texas where everybody's together to some places. Notre Dame has the students staying by dorm. And so, and they don't have co-ed dorms. So you see sections of men, sections of women, so you see where and how fans are showing up in different places. It's just so different. It's so many different places, and people are making the best decisions they can, I guess. Hope that helps, Josh.
Great. Well, thank you very much. I'm seeing that we are at time and certainly want to respect your time. So, you know, on behalf of all of us, I'd like to thank you very much, Greg, for joining us. And if there's any additional questions afterwards, I'll certainly stick around. So thank you very much for your time.
Yeah, I'm G Simmons at umbc.edu. So if you had a question that you didn't get to, or if there's something I can do to be helpful, please don't hesitate to just shoot me a note, and I'd be happy to follow up if I can. Okay.
Great. Thank you very much. And
thanks, everyone. Stay
thanks
safe.
Again. Be safe. Take care.